Chapter 11. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Divorce Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Fanya packed her things and brought Tang Tang to Xiao Xiang's house. She did not want her daughter to stay around and watch the process of her divorce, and she did not want it to affect her daughter's future growth. Xiao Xiang did not ask any more questions and happily carried Tang Tang over. However, the moment Fanya left, Xiao Xiang watched her retreating back and said softly, "Do whatever you must. The child is with me. Don't worry." Xiao Xiang said sincerely. At that moment, Fanya's eyes suddenly turned slightly red. She did not turn around. She just nodded gently and left quickly. When she arrived at the law firm, Tang Fu had already been waiting in the reception room for a long time. Lin Bin and Xiao Xia were also there. There were a few documents piled in front of them. "Sign the papers today. We'll apply for a divorce tomorrow," Tang Fu said as he motioned for Lin Bin to show the documents to Fanya. Fanya flipped through the documents. After a moment, she said, "I don't agree to this divorce proposal." Tang Fu had not expected Fanya to react as so. He was immediately stunned. Didn't you say that you wanted a divorce?" Fanya nodded and a smile appeared on her face. She looked so comfortable that people could not help but take a deep breath. "I agreed to a divorce, but..." Fanya drew a circle in the divorce property distribution column. "This place needs to be changed." "How?" Tang Fu asked with a trembling voice. "It's very simple. I want 2/3 of your property. My daughter and I deserve it." Fanya said lightly. "In your dreams." Tang Fu stood up from his chair. "Giving you half alone is already me being generous." Tang Fu said coldly. "Really?" The smile on Fanya's face did not change. She took out a small MP3 player from her bag. "Listen to the contents of this first," Fanya said and handed the MP3 to Xiao Xia. Xiao Xia quickly connected the MP3 to a small speaker and immediately heard the conversation between the two women. "You two are having an affair." Fanya's voice was still as calm as ever. Yang Noah's continuous sharp roars made the entire reception room quiet down. After a long while, Tang Fu sat back down on the chair. He wiped the sweat off his forehead and said, "This is not considered evidence." Fanya smiled and said, "I still have the video in my hands. Do you want to see it?" Tang Fu immediately broke out in cold sweat. He subconsciously leaned back in his chair and said, "That 2/3 is too much." The smile on Fanya's lips did not change. "If you have cheated on me, I can make you leave with nothing. But seeing that you have been treating our daughter and myself quite well these few years, I will at least give you and that woman." Fanya said, deliberately not mentioning the child. "I'll leave some for you so that you can have a better life in the future." As Fanya said this, she used a pen to lightly write a number on the document. "I think your assets should be this much." As Fanya said this, she added a 0 after the original number. Tang Fu had not expected Fanya to know this. They had been husband and wife for so many years, and Fanya never once cared about his assets and businesses. However, he did not expect Fanya to be aware of his exact numbers at the moment of the divorce. Tang Fu leaned against the back of his chair with some disappointment and turned to Lin Bin for help. Lin Bin cleared his throat and said, "President Tang, I think Madam's request is reasonable. I suggest that you do not hide your assets. According to the amount negotiated by both parties." Lin Bin said and paused. "It will be better for your reputation and business." Listening to Lin Bin's hesitation, Tang Fu suddenly remembered a business that he had been following up on recently. That old man was famous for loving his wife. If he knew that he had divorced his wife because of an affair, he might not be able to continue with the business. Tang Fu sighed heavily and said to Lin Bin, resigned to his fate, changed the agreement. Sign it immediately. At that moment, he was really in a dilemma. Whenever he went to see the old man, Yang Nuo was always by his side. The intimate actions of the two had long made the old man think that they were a couple. Yang Nuo had acted like so to make things difficult for him. No matter what, she had to get him to divorce Fanya. Otherwise, she would go to the old man anytime she felt like it and expose him. Tang Fu thought about it and decided to divorce Fanya. However, he had never expected to encounter such a thing. The more Tang Fu thought about it, the more aggrieved he felt, but he still decided to settle it as soon as possible. Xiao Xia immediately took out her computer to modify the agreement. It did not take long for it to be printed out and for both parties to sign. By that afternoon, Fanya and Tang Fu went to the Civil Affairs Bureau to change their certificates. Chapter 12. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Moving Houses Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Fanya took the divorce certificate and went to Xiao Xiang's house to pick Tang Tang up. Xiao Xiang looked at Fanya's indifferent expression and could not guess what had happened to her. She hesitated for a moment before asking, "Why don't we have dinner here today?" Fanya looked at Xiao Xiang and nodded slowly. After dinner, Xiao Xiang walked Fanya and her daughter out of the alley and said, "No matter which road you take in the future, remember to come back for dinner more often." Fanya smiled at Xiao Xiang. "Okay." Tang Tang happily waved at Xiao Xiang. "Bye, Ms. Fang." After seeing the mother and daughter off, Xiao Xiang gently wiped the tears from the corner of his eyes and walked back home. After bringing Tang Tang home, Fanya took out the luggage that she had prepared beforehand, held Tang Tang's hand, and walked out of the house. Uncle Tang wanted to stop her, but he knew that there was no meaning at this time. He took out a bunch of keys and said to Fanya, "This is my family's old residence. If you don't mind." Fanya shook her head and rejected Uncle Tang's kind offer. "I've already booked the hotel. Sorry to trouble you, Uncle Tang." Uncle Tang sighed and watched Fanya leave the Tang family with her daughter. Fanya brought Tang Tang to the hotel that she had booked beforehand. Ever since she had been reborn, Fanya had put much thought into many matters. She was no longer the foolish woman who simply accepted everything. She needed to live well for her daughter and for herself. When they arrived at the hotel, Tang Tang found the whole situation in room so fresh and new that she grew too excited to sleep. Fanya was not in a hurry either. She patiently coaxed Tang Tang until she fell into a deep sleep. Looking at the time, it was already 3 o'clock in the morning. Fanya washed up briefly, leaned against the sofa, and quietly closed her eyes. Since her rebirth, she had been making these arrangements without stopping. She hoped that through her own efforts, she could escape the painful fate of her previous life and let her daughter live a better life. Tang Fu was very determined to get a divorce. Therefore, after signing the agreement, he liquidated 2/3 of his assets into cash and gave it to Fanya. Fanya signed the agreement willingly and did not want to be entangled with Tang Fu any longer. Fanya decided to rest in the hotel for the day. Tomorrow, she would find a suitable place for a single mother and daughter to stay. Fanya fell asleep in a daze. When she opened her eyes again, she saw Tang Tang lying in front of her, blinking her eyes. "Mom, aren't we going home?" Tang Tang asked in confusion. Her mother had taken her here at night. She had been very happy and curious. But, this was not home. Fanya smiled gently and took her daughter into her arms. "Tang Tang, be good. We'll go look for our home after daybreak." "Look." Tang Tang did not quite understand what her mother meant. She blinked her eyes in confusion and looked at her. Fanya's smile deepened. "Yes, Tang Tang will be with Mom forever in the future, okay? Then. What about Dad?" Tang Tang showed a confused expression. Tang Tang did not rely on her dad very much because he would always throw a tantrum at her. But, there should be a dad at home, right? Also, what about Grandpa Butler? Tang Tang asked more seriously. She could not bear to leave the kindly old butler. Fanya held Tang Tang tightly in her arms. From now on, there will only be the two of us in our home. Tang Tang's expression became somewhat conflicted. She thought for a moment before asking, "Can Ms. Fong be with us?" Fanya was stunned for a moment. After thinking seriously for a moment, she said, "Perhaps." Hearing Fanya's words, Tang Tang seemed to have finally calmed down and fell asleep again in a daze. Fanya put Tang Tang back on the bed and laid down beside her. "Go to sleep. When you wake up, everything will be fine." As Fanya spoke, she reached out and gently stroked her daughter's forehead. The next day, Fanya sent Tang Tang to Xiao Xiang's residence. Tang Tang and Xiao Xiang were both very happy. Xiao Xiang had specially prepared delicious food for Tang Tang, as well as a small pillow and blanket for her afternoon nap. Fanya felt at ease when she placed her daughter at Xiao Xiang's place. She still had many things to do. Fanya found herself a real estate agent and found a decent-sized lot in the suburbs. It was not particularly huge. There were 4 rooms and a separate bathroom. Although there was still a large gap between it and the ideal home in Fanya's mind, Fanya knew that she had returned to 20 years ago. She could not look at it with her current eyes. After tucking away the house key, Fanya simply tidied up the interior of the house. Fortunately, the house had been occupied recently and did not require much tidying up and decorating. After Fanya had prepared everything, she went back to Xiao Xiang's residence to fetch Tang Tang back. Xiao Xiang looked at Fanya's somewhat tired expression and asked, "Have you been doing anything recently?" Fanya did not intend to say anything more. She only smiled faintly. "Nothing." Xiao Xiang knew that it was not her place to ask any further, so she fell silent. She brought Tang Tang to the small lot. Tang Tang was immediately attracted by the flowers and plants in the courtyard. Fanya looked at Tang Tang's carefree appearance and felt a lot more at ease. Chapter 13. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Looking for a job. Looking for a man. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Although Fanya had obtained a lot of money from Tang Fu, she could not just sit around idly. However, she had not been to work since she married Tang Fu, so she was not familiar with the outside world. If she wanted to get a job that could support her and her daughter, she would need to work hard. For the next 2 to 3 months, Fanya was busy taking care of her daughter while finding her a suitable kindergarten. Every single day, she was busy. The suburbs were nothing like the city. The transportation was not convenient, but the relationship between the neighbors was much warmer. Fanya had only moved there for less than a week. All the neighbors within 3 kilometers knew that a single mother with her own child had moved in. Although they did not know why Fanya was alone, it was inevitable that rumors would spread. The neighbor, a generously sized middle-aged woman, was a warm-hearted person. Every time she saw Fanya alone with her baby, she would go up and chat with her. The husband of that woman was a tall and thin man. He was silent and looked cold. Fanya was not particularly fond of interacting with people. Whenever she met someone like the woman who liked to pry into other people's privacy, she would avoid them. The woman had 2 sons, one was 18 and the other was 14 years old. The 2 sons were tall and strong, but they did not like to talk much. Every time the woman saw Fanya, she would say that there was no one in the family who could talk, and then she would talk endlessly with Fanya about the Zhang family and the Li family. Although Fanya did not like to hear this, she could not avoid it. Through it, she quickly became familiar with the neighbors from the large woman's large mouth. The woman not only liked to chat with Fanya, but was also especially fond of Tang Tang. Every day, she said that when Tang Tang grew up, she would definitely let one of her sons marry Tang Tang. Fanya liked the woman's two sons very much. Although the two children did not talk much, they would greet her politely when they saw her. If they saw her in need of help, they would also do their best to help out. Fanya lived in such an environment for almost half a year. Half a year later, Tang Tang successfully entered a kindergarten, and Fanya began to look for a job for herself. On one particular day, Fanya sent Tang Tang to the kindergarten and went home alone. She met the woman at the door of her home, and Fanya took the initiative to walk over to her. "Auntie, I'll have to trouble you with something. If you have something to say, just say it. Don't stand on ceremony," the woman said cheerfully. Her beaming face looked warm-hearted. "I want to find a job," Fanya said with some embarrassment. The woman looked at Fanya, but her face was full of confusion. "Do you need money? If you need money, it's okay. You can say it. You can make up for it with whatever you have," the woman said seriously. "No," Fanya answered honestly, "I just want to find a job." The woman thought for a while and said, "I'll have to ask around. Leave it to me." Fanya nodded her head to thank her with a faint smile on her face. The woman looked at Fanya and thought to herself for a while before saying, "Fong, have you considered taking another step?" Fanya looked at the woman in confusion. "You see, Tang Tang is still young and you are still young. If you take care of her alone," the woman hesitated for a while. "It's just so much work." The woman finally voiced out her thoughts. Fanya shook her head and said, "I think it's still pretty manageable." The woman frowned in disagreement. "You are a woman and you have to take care of a child on your own. It's too much. You still have to find a man to rely on," the woman said earnestly. "How about this? I'll help you find a job, but I'll also keep an eye out for good men," the woman promised solemnly. Fanya wanted to refuse, but she knew that the woman only meant well. She smiled and said, "Then I'll have to trouble you. As for the men," Fanya said, pausing for a moment before saying, "Let's leave it to fate." The woman smiled and patted her own chest, saying, "Don't worry, my connections are absolutely reliable. When the time comes, just don't forget to give me wedding candies," the woman said with a smile. Suddenly, the woman's husband poked his head out from his own courtyard and said expressionlessly, "The pot is burnt." When the woman heard this, she slapped her forehead and cried out in a low voice, "Aya, what do I do now?" Before Fanya could respond, the woman only said, "Please go ahead." Then she hurried back to her own yard. Fanya shook her head with a smile and walked into her own yard. Chapter 14. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Remarrying Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. The woman was superhuman. In just half a day, she got Fanya a job as a clerk in the neighborhood committee. During then, most of the neighborhood committee members were women in their 40s or 50s or even older. They mainly did the tasks of organizing and contacting, and a part of their important work was to talk about the daily lives of the people in the area. These people generally did not have very high academic qualifications, so they were not good at word processing. Fanya happened to be able to help them in this area, so she naturally entered the neighborhood committee to work. Fanya sent Tang Tang to the kindergarten every day, and then reported to the neighborhood committee. At night, after work, she picked Tang Tang back. The kindergarten was a distance from home. Sister Nyo in the neighborhood committee saw Fanya doing this every day, so she suggested that Fanya transfer the child to the neighborhood committee's exclusive nursery. It could take care of the child nearby and also prevent Fanya from running around. Fanya thought about it. In another year, Tang Tang would go to school. This might be a good idea. However, on the second day of Tang Tang's school in the nursery, she came crying to Fanya. Fanya looked at Tang Tang, her heart aching. "What's wrong?" Tang Tang wiped her tears and said, "Little Rock said that I don't have a father." Seeing Tang Tang cry so sadly, Fanya could not help but sigh. You do have a father. Have you forgotten? Tang Tang looked at Fanya aggrievedly. Then why doesn't father come to see us? Your father and I have gone our separate ways. Tang Tang is living with me temporarily. Fanya hugged Tang Tang and explained patiently. Father is very busy at work. Tang Tang also knows that. Fanya continued, he currently has no way to come and see Tang Tang. Tang Tang listened with a half-understanding look, but her eyes were still full of grievance. At that moment, Fanya's memory suddenly returned to her previous life. That day, Tang Tang had stood at the front door of her house, pointing at Fanya's nose, scolding her for being useless. She scolded her for marrying an unfaithful man, and she scolded her for leaving home with nothing. She scolded her for not having money, for not having the ability to support herself, and for still overestimating herself by taking her away. She scolded her for not having the ability, yet still trying to rely on others for money. Back then, Fanya had deeply doubted herself, even hating herself. In her previous life, when Tang Tang was young, she constantly hugged herself, often bawling inconsolably. But at that time, Fanya was so busy that she did not have time to listen to her cries. Fanya was exhausted from running for her life, and in the end, all she earned was Tang Tang's hatred. Fanya suddenly thought that maybe she really should give Tang Tang a complete home. From that day on, Fanya no longer resisted the woman's attempts of introducing her to more men. Lo. Did you hear? That He Feng moved to our district, Sister Nyo said to her colleague, Little Wang. Really? Is it that He Feng who was in the newspaper? Little Wang asked in surprise. Of course. Sister Nyo was even more excited and started gossiping. My nephew saw him move in with his own eyes. That's really. Little Wang was about to say, that's great, but she was stopped by Sister Nyo. I heard that he has a child with him. I really didn't expect. Sister Nyo shook her head and sighed. A child. Little Wang was puzzled. I never knew that he got married. Ha. Sister Nyo waved her hand. How can such a thing be written in the newspapers? He's a national hero. Sister Nyo raised her voice slightly and said, don't tell me he has to write about his wife being a cuckold while he's on a mission. Ha. Even he's not exempt from that. Little Wang's voice rose several octaves. I heard that he was out on official business all year round. His wife couldn't stand the loneliness, so she fell in love with one of his brothers. Sister Nyo said and sighed. This woman should be soaked in a pig cage. Little Wang said fiercely. After He Feng returned from his meritorious service, that woman knew that the matter couldn't be hidden anymore, so she left the child behind and ran away. Sister Nyo pursed her lips, and her expression looked very disdainful. So He Feng has to care for the child on his own, how? Little Wang asked anxiously. How is he going to carry out his work? Sister Nyo asked the rest of the question for Little Wang. Yes, yes. Little Wang nodded heavily. I heard that he has already resigned from his job as a special police officer, and he is currently applying to work at our Public Security Bureau. Sister Nyo raised her eyebrows and said to Little Wang, at your brother's place. When Little Wang heard this, she became even more excited. That's great. Girl, you're being too obvious. As Sister Nyo said this, she looked at Little Wang's increasingly excited expression. Don't you mind that he's a second wife with a child? What's the big deal? Little Wang pouted. I want a hero like He Feng. Hearing Little Wang's bold words, the surrounding ladies and aunties could not help but laugh. Fanya sat in the corner, quietly listening, eyes slowly raised, looking in the direction of Little Wang. Chapter 15. You are listening at Novelfull.audio. The Woman Under the Old Pagoda Tree Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless fantasy translation. He Feng moved all his luggage into the house. Looking at the unfamiliar environment, he took a deep breath. His son, Xiaopeng, packed his things and walked out of the room. "Dad, I've packed everything," Xiaopeng said dutifully. The expression on his face looked very serious. He Feng replied with an affirmative grunt and decided to set his things down and cook for his son first. The father and son worked from morning to afternoon, but they had not taken a single bite. "Take a rest for a while and start eating right away," He Feng said and walked into the kitchen. Xiaopeng replied and obediently went back to his room. He picked up a book and started reading. He Feng placed the food on the table. When he went to ask his son to eat, he found that he had already fallen asleep on the table. He Feng went forward and gently picked up his son, put him on the bed, and covered him with the quilt. Over the past 6 months, his son had suffered a lot with him. He Feng and his ex-wife had been match-made by someone. He Feng was a person who lived abroad all year round. Because he was constantly on missions, his whereabouts were erratic, and it was hard to say when he could be contacted. He Feng could understand his wife's dissatisfaction with him. Therefore, when he heard that his wife was cheating on him, He Feng's heart had remained stoic. For him, this had long been in the works. All these years, his wife had been pregnant with his child, eventually giving birth, and He Feng had not been around to take care of her. When his son was 4 or 5 years old, he still obediently called He Feng uncle whenever he saw him. He Feng knew that he owed too much to this family. For his wife, he felt more guilt than love. His son was almost 8 years old now. He Feng had been absent throughout most of his life, so he had been a little distant with him, but was then treating him with growing politeness each passing day. When his wife left, she had not taken him away. Unconditionally, his son had followed He Feng around for nearly half a year. In order to take better care of his son, He Feng had to submit an application to the Higher.UPS. Because of his exemplary track record in the army, He Feng was recommended to the City Public Security Bureau as the chief of the security team. The family property had all been signed in the name of his wife. After his wife left, he sold the family home. Left with no choice, He Feng and his son could only rent a house in the suburbs for the moment. Fortunately, He Feng's old leader was bent on helping him and tried his best to arrange a decent lot for him. A 2-room terrace was enough for the father and son to live in. On the day He Feng moved into his new house, many neighbors came to visit him. This place was simple and honest. Compared to the hustle and bustle in the city center, it breathed with much more humanity. Many neighbors brought food and drinks. They also told He Feng, a grown man, to care for his child personally. If it was inconvenient, he could always ask them for help. He Feng was not good at communicating with people. In the face of such warm treatment, he did not know how to respond. Fortunately, his son, Xiaopeng, displayed his exceptional social skills. He handled all the uncles and aunts around him properly. Looking at the plates on the table, big and small, with all kinds of delicacies in them, Xiaopeng could not help but swallow his saliva. As he stared at his son, He Feng could not help but feel a pang in his heart. He was not good at cooking. He had been out for many years and was able to make do with street food and instant noodles. Now that he was taking care of his son, he was at a loss. In order to take care of his son, He Feng sent his son to school every morning and then went to work. The father and son always showed up at the door at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning on time. Occasionally, they would see a woman standing quietly under an old pagoda tree. He Feng could not put his finger on it. He kept feeling a little desolate as he watched the woman's back. One of the old men always said that there must be a demon under the old pagoda tree. Looking at the woman's appearance, He Feng felt that she was more like a person whose soul had yet to return. Because he had moved to a new home, He Feng took the materials for himself and his son and went to the nearby neighborhood committee to go through the relevant procedures. When Sister Niu saw He Feng in person, she immediately hissed for little Wang to come over. Unfortunately, little Wang had just left the house, so she had missed this opportunity. Sister Nyo muttered a few words to herself, then she looked at He Feng with a smile. "Hello, Captain He." When He Feng saw that Sister Nyo recognized him, a faint blush appeared on his tanned face. "Hello. I wish to move my son and my household registration to this side," He Feng said as he handed over the documents in his hand. Sister Nyo looked at the documents and shouted in Feng Ye's direction, "Little Feng, come and handle the materials." Feng Ye nodded and walked over. She took the documents and returned to her seat. Chapter 16. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Arranging a blind date translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. While they were waiting, Sister Nyo pulled He Feng aside and chatted a lot. Little Wang also came back at that moment. When she saw He Feng, she was so excited that she almost screamed. Feng Ye was by no means a slow worker, but the paperwork took her half an hour. When all the materials were ready, Sister Nyo handed the materials to He Feng and said, "If you need anything, come find us. We'll be on call." Little Wang did not forget to add. He Feng grinned and turned to leave. In an instant, he caught a glimpse of the figure in the corner and found it somewhat familiar. He Feng's old leader would come to He Feng's house from time to time to check on the father and son's diet, berating him and providing healthier options. He knew that He Feng was a grown man who did not know how to take care of children, and he was also worried that his precious grandson would be malnourished. Looking at little Peng's reserved manner in front of He Feng, the old leader felt a pang of heartache. "I say, have you considered finding a mother for your child?" The old leader could not help but ask. He Feng did not even miss a beat and shook his head without hesitation. "I'm not considering it." "You brat." The old leader frowned disapprovingly. "Even if you're not thinking for yourself, you have to think for little Peng. He still needs someone to take care of him." The old leader said earnestly. "Look at you, how can you take care of a child?" He Feng was about to refute him, but when he remembered how his son always looked nervous in front of him, he could not help but hesitate. "How about this, I'll help you find him," the old leader said and patted his chest. "I guarantee that she'll be a virtuous and terrific mother." "My current conditions." He Feng was still a little hesitant. "What's wrong with your conditions?" "The country recognizes you." The old leader was annoyed at his skepticism. "You can't turn your back on all women just because of one woman." "I'm not." He Feng wanted to explain, but he did not know where to start. "Enough. Listen to me. Just do it." The old leader stopped He Feng mid-sentence. Although He Feng was hesitant, he agreed when he thought of his son. On a sunny afternoon, a large woman happily held Feng Ye by the hand. "We have a full schedule all round. Your first date is this Sunday morning at the newly opened beverage shop at the corner of the street." Feng Ye was a little confused. She looked at the woman as if she did not understand what she meant. "Aya." The woman saw Feng Ye's blank look and grabbed her arm. She forced Feng Ye, who was one head taller than her, to bend over. Feng Ye leaned to the side and placed her ear next to the woman's lips. The men I've been hunting for you. The first one's a top-notch man." The woman said in a low voice, unable to hide the excitement in her tone. Hearing this, Feng Ye's expression froze. Then, she nodded and said to the woman, "Okay, then I'll have to trouble you, auntie." Since she had decided to take this step, there was no reason for her to retreat. On Sunday morning, the newly opened beverage shop had just updated its catalog. The warm sunlight shone into the shop from the front door, producing a particularly comfortable feeling. Feng Ye sat alone in the shop, wearing a plain white dress that was pleasing to the eye from afar. Feng Ye sat in the beverage shop, quietly stirring the concocted drink in her hand. Her gaze was fixed on the beverage, and she was actually a little nervous. Although she had been married for many years, she did not have much experience in love after all. Now, for her daughter's sake, she was willing to take another step, but she did not know whether this was the right step. Fanya had deliberately turned up at the shop earlier, hoping to calm herself down. She needed some time to adjust herself, and she also needed to have enough confidence to face the other party. At the entrance of the beverage shop, an old man with white hair said to the young man beside him, "Be steadfast, be optimistic. Put a smile on that face. Show me the courage of a soldier." The old man encouraged the young man again. The young man's face was slightly tanned, and his eyes and brows were particularly distinct. He was practically exuding a heroic spirit. The young man nodded slightly and did not say anything. The old man could not help but sigh and said, "Hifeng, when you see the girl later, be politer to the fairer sex. Smile more, you have muscles in your face, use them, they're not made of wood. Got it?" The old man patted Hifeng's shoulder and said. The old man was still a bit worried. His eyes were fixed on Hifeng, as if he was trying to read him. Chapter 17. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The Gentle Hifeng Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Hifeng looked at the old man with a serious face. "Old leader, I'm going to be late." When the old man heard this, he immediately let out an "ah" and pushed the door open and pushed Hifeng in. "Behave well." The old man did not forget to remind him softly once again through the door. When the shop assistant at the door saw Hifeng, she stood stunned for a moment. After a long while, she let out an "ah" and said, "Mr. He. Are you Mr. He?" Hifeng nodded awkwardly, and his face was stained with a suspicious red. "Mr. He, are you here alone or with a friend?" The shop assistant's excited expression looked as if she was about to pounce on him. Hifeng cleared his throat and said, "I'm meeting someone." "Then you have an appointment with..." The shop assistant hesitated for a moment before asking, "Is your friend here?" Hifeng frowned. He really wanted to answer that he did not know. At this moment, his gaze swept over a woman in white. On the table in front of the woman was a small booklet. Hifeng nodded at the shop assistant, indicating that he had found the person, then walked straight to the woman's table. "Hello, may I know who you are?" Hifeng said, his gaze fixed on the woman's face. The woman raised her head slightly. In the next moment, both of them were stunned. Fanya had never expected to see Hifeng here. Hifeng looked at the woman's face and gradually overlapped her visage with that of the figure under the old pagoda tree. After being stunned for a moment, Hifeng spoke again, "Are you Miss Fanya?" Fanya nodded, stood up, and extended her hand to Hifeng. Hifeng politely shook hands with Fanya. The two of them took their seats, and their gazes awkwardly shifted away from each other. The shop assistant walked over at that moment. "May I help you too?" Fanya pointed at the cup in front of her. "No, thank you." Hifeng, on the other hand, frowned, not knowing what to choose for a moment. He had been out fighting all year round, so he had no time to spend in such a shop, so he naturally did not know what to order. Fanya saw Hifeng's predicament and quickly helped him out. "Give this gentleman a glass of water. He just came in." "We'll order later," Fanya said politely to the shop assistant. The shop assistant responded and turned to prepare for Hifeng. Hifeng looked at Fanya and said softly, "Thank you." Fanya slightly curved her lips. Her smile looked faint, but it made people feel particularly comfortable. Hifeng looked at Fanya and said after a moment, "I seem to have met you before." "Yes, we have met." Fanya said without any hesitation, "When you came to the neighborhood committee." "No. Not at that time." Hifeng shook his head. Fanya was a little surprised. "Have we met somewhere else?" "Yes." Hifeng nodded and said, "Miss Fong, do you like that old locust tree very much?" Hearing Hifeng's words, Fanya immediately understood what Hifeng meant. She sighed in her heart and said, "That place makes me feel very comfortable." What Fang Ye said was absolutely true. She had the memories of her previous life, and her heart was filled with too many unresolved puzzles and melancholy. Every time she stood under the old pagoda tree, she would always be able to relax for a moment. She never expected someone to notice her at that time, and she did not expect that person to be He Feng. In her memory, He Feng was a decisive man. Every time he appeared in newspapers and magazines, his appearance was frighteningly cold. Most of the news about He Feng on television revolved around his military achievements and military exploits. Unexpectedly, the He Feng in front of Fang Ye was actually a gentle and somewhat shy man. Fang Ye looked at He Feng with a flash of curiosity in her eyes. He Feng caught this hint of information and the corners of his mouth curled up slightly. He used to think that the woman standing under the old pagoda tree would be a gloomy, solemn woman. At least at that time, he only felt gloom from her. When he saw her again in the neighborhood committee, He Feng had the impression that she was a quiet woman. Now that they had met for the third time, He Feng realized that this woman was generous, gentle, and made him feel warm. He Feng suddenly became curious. What kind of story did this woman have? I heard that you are also divorced with children. He Feng asked bluntly. Since he wanted to date her, he had no intention of hiding anything. Fang Ye stared at He Feng and then nodded. Yes. I haven't been divorced for long, and have a 5-year-old daughter. Chapter 18. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. A person to rely on. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Fang Ye and He Feng chatted for more than 2 hours in the beverage shop. Both of them had gained a feeling of mutual appreciation. Although it was not to the extent of getting married right away, at least the two of them did not hate each other. For Fang Ye, it had been a long time since anyone was able to make her truly say the words that had been buried in her heart. He Feng sent Fang Ye home and then rushed to his old leader's house to pick up his son. Tang Tang had already been taken to her own home by the large woman. The woman had often said that Tang Tang would be her future daughter. In law. Now, she had to let her eat, drink, and have all kinds of fun. Fang Ye was helpless, but she also knew that the woman had been nothing but genuinely kind to Tang Tang. Fang Ye always advised the woman not to spoil Tang Tang too much, or she would grow pampered. The woman's theory, however, was that she had to spoil this future daughter. In law well. Otherwise, what if someone gave her candy and ran off with her? Fang Ye was both helpless and gratified by the woman's theory. With the woman helping her take care of Tang Tang, she had indeed saved a lot of effort. Fang Ye knocked on the door of the woman's house and heard Tang Tang's excited laughter. Fang Ye could not help but shake her head and smile. The next second, the woman opened the door and asked Fang Ye, "How was it?" "Happy." Fang Ye nodded slightly, a faint smile slipping in from the corners of her mouth. The woman pulled Fang Ye inside without any explanation. Come in and talk to me." Fang Ye did not refuse and followed her in. When Tang Tang saw that Fang Ye had come, she swung her small hands that were full of mud and rushed over. "Mommy." Fang Ye hugged her daughter and kissed her face twice. The woman held Tang Tang's small hands and rushed her to the tap at the side. Fang Ye looked at Tang Tang being tugged around by the large woman and could not help but find it amusing. Tang Tang followed the two of them into the house and automatically climbed onto Fang Ye's legs. Leaning comfortably on Fang Ye's body, Tang Tang let out a breath. "Mommy, where did you go today?" Fang Ye paused for a moment, not knowing how to answer her question. Seeing this, the woman smiled and asked Tang Tang, "Does Tang Tang want a father?" "Yes." Tang Tang nodded without hesitation. "Then, can you find a new father for Tang Tang?" The woman continued to ask. Tang Tang looked at the woman with a half-understanding look. She frowned and thought for a moment. "Why do you want a new father? Does Tang Tang like old father very much?" Seeing this, the woman asked again. This time, Tang Tang fell into deep thought. Fanya looked at her daughter with some nervousness. She did not know how she would react. After a long while, Tang Tang raised her head and looked at the woman. Tang Tang doesn't like old father. But. Tang Tang hesitated again. Father is father. Hearing Tang Tang's words, Fanya finally heaved a sigh of relief. Only then did the woman pinch Tang Tang's little face and smile. That daddy is old, we don't want him anymore. Let's change to a new one, okay? The woman pressed on. Tang Tang thought about it very seriously. Like changing to a new doll? Yes. Would Tang Tang like new dolls? The woman probed again. Tang Tang nodded heavily. Tang Tang likes new dolls. Tang Tang likes new fathers. Seeing this, Fanya smiled bitterly at the woman. When manipulated and led on in such a way, it was no wonder that Tang Tang was willing to stay at the woman's place every day. The woman looked at Fanya with a smug look on her face. The woman pulled Fanya over to chat a little more. After a while, Tang Tang fell into a deep sleep in Fanya's arms. Fanya was about to leave with the child in her arms, but the woman stopped her. Let Tang Tang sleep here for a while. I still have some stuff to say to you, the woman said seriously. Seeing the woman's expression, Fanya nodded. She put Tang Tang on the small bed at the side, covered her with a quilt, and sat back down in the small hall. That person, what do you think? The woman asked nervously. I heard that he's a soldier. I've never seen this person before. The woman was a little conflicted. My contact simply said that he's a very reliable man. The woman was a little hesitant, and then she continued, originally, I wanted to introduce you to my biological brother. But after thinking about it, that guy doesn't have a proper job. The woman shook her head and said, although he works as a chauffeur for some boss. It's a superficial job. It's not that reliable. The woman shared her point of view. Uncle Lee happened to say that he has a friend who just recently got divorced. The woman said with some distress, it sounds like the conditions are good. That's why I asked you to take a look. Fanya looked at the woman and knew that she was really worried about her. She smiled and said, well, don't worry. This person is very reliable. The woman finally calmed down. Chapter 19 You are listening at novelfull.audio. Together with Hifeng. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation Fanya brought Tang Tang home and did not make any contact with Hifeng for a few days. Firstly, Hifeng's house did not have a phone installed yet. Secondly, Fanya was also worried about what Hifeng would think. Fanya did not feel anything adverse against Hifeng. At least, Hifeng was a good choice for her. Since she planned to take this step, she had to choose a reliable person. Otherwise, if she made a repeat of the Tang Fu episode of her life, Fanya would be really miserable. In her previous life, there had been very little information about Hifeng's private life. That it was only rumored that he only had one marriage. After the divorce, he had lived alone with his son. However, his son, Hipeng, was often praised by the world for being able to grow into a military genius under his guidance alone. Fanya did not know if Hifeng had any misgivings about remarrying or about her. In short, Hifeng had not taken the initiative to contact her, so Fanya did not intend to probe him. But one afternoon, as Fanya still working hard in the neighborhood committee, little Wang ran over in a huff and put a bag of things on her desk. Fanya looked up at little Wang in confusion, not knowing what she was angry about. Little Wang had been arranged by her brother to join the neighborhood committee. She was much younger than the others. Although Fanya was not much older than little Wang, she looked more mature and ladylike because she was already married and had children. Little Wang snorted and said, when did you get together with Hifeng? Fanya was confused by little Wang's question. She looked at her and still did not say anything. Little Wang gestured with his chin and motioned for Fanya to look at the bag. Fanya opened the bag and saw that there were many fruits inside. This. Little Wang snorted and said, "This is the holiday fruit that they just distributed. He Feng said that my brother would send it to you." Little Wang glared at Fanya. "Why didn't I know when you two got together?" When Fanya heard this, she stood up unhappily. "Don't be so harsh. What's wrong with my words?" Little Wang put her hands on her waist and glared at Fanya. "What do you mean by getting together?" Fanya focused on Little Wang's words, her tone filled with dissatisfaction. "We're both divorced. Even if we really get together, it's not up to you to judge," Fanya said sternly. Little Wang obviously did not expect Fanya to bite back, so she was a little dumbfounded. A moment later, Little Wang found the courage again and said, "You are a divorced woman, and you have the nerve to suck up to He Feng." Fanya stared at Little Wang with her bright eyes. "First, whether I get divorced or not is my business. Second, I did not suck up to He Feng, the relationship between him and me is aboveboard. Fanya did not do anything wrong, and her words were full of confidence. You. Little Wang was a little angry for a moment and did not know what to say. Sister Nyo and the others had just returned from lunch. Seeing that the two of them were at daggers drawn, they quickly came up to break them up. "What's wrong?" Sister Nyo looked at the two of them in puzzlement. Little Wang pulled Sister Nyo's arm with an aggrieved look and pointed at the bag of fruits on the table. "He Feng sent someone to deliver them." Sister Nyo could not help but be a little surprised when she heard that. She took 2 steps forward and looked at the things in the bag. They were really good things. Sister Nyo looked up at Fanya and asked, "You and He Feng are together?" Sister Nyo's tone was very different from Little Wang's. Sister Nyo's tone was full of concern. She was really curious about Fanya's situation. Fanya shook her head and denied again, "I know He Feng, but we're not together yet. So it's possible." Sister Nyo suddenly beamed. "From the looks of it, He Feng must be interested in you." Fanya still shook her head and did not say anything else. Little Wang tugged at Sister Nyo's sleeve unhappily. "How could He Feng?" Sister Nyo patted Xiaowang's hand and smiled. "Fanya's condition is not bad. If He Feng can marry her, he won't be at a disadvantage." When Fanya heard Sister Nyo's words, her face immediately turned hot. The matter between the two of them had not even been settled yet, and now that Sister Nyo had spoken so confidently, Fanya did not know what to say. Sister Nyo looked at Fanya's appearance and smiled as she patted her shoulder. "Divorce is not a sin. You have to think more about Tang Tang's future," Sister Nyo said earnestly. Hearing Sister Nyo's words, Fanya's gaze was fixed on her face. Seeing that she was truly trying to persuade her, she nodded after a long while. Chapter 20. You are listening at novelfull.audio. You could try Dating Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Although He Feng did not show up in person, he caused quite a stir in the neighborhood committee. When Fanya returned home, she happened to see the large woman walking out of her house. "Ah! Fanya, you're back." The woman walked quickly to Fanya and put the basin in her hand aside. She pulled Fanya to the old tree root at the door. The two sat on the tree root and the woman said, "I heard He Feng gave you something." Fanya was surprised. In just half a day, the news had reached the woman's ears. Fanya nodded and then took out a few fruits from her bag and handed them to the woman. The woman pushed Fanya's hand away, not intending to take the fruits. "What's he like?" the woman asked again, "Do you think he's okay?" Fanya pursed her lips slightly. She thought for a moment and said, "He's a good person. Maybe he'll be a good father. I heard that his wife cheated on him and ran away." The woman lowered her voice and looked around before she said, "Yeah, I heard that too." Fanya nodded and confirmed it. I think this man should be a good man, but I'm afraid. The woman frowned and did not know how to continue. Fanya smiled and said, I just hope to find a suitable man to take care of Tang Tang with me when she grows up. The woman saw Fanya's expression and could not help but frown even more. You can't think like that. Tang Tang is important, but she will have her own life in the future, the woman continued to persuade her. You have to think for yourself. In the future, the woman leaned forward again and whispered, this man is the one you can rely on. Fanya still shook her head. She did not want to rely on anyone, and she never expected anyone to be her benefactor. She only wanted to grow old peacefully with one person. Even if, in the end, they would still be separated. Seeing that Fanya seemed to be indifferent to the affairs of the world, the woman could not help but continue to advise her, this person, try to get along with him. If you feel that you can't do it, I will find you a good one. Fanya looked at the woman gratefully. She knew that if they were talking about conditions, He Feng would definitely be the best. He could become a general of the empire through his own efforts, so how could he be any worse? Fanya grabbed the woman's hand, a faint smile on her lips. I will try my best to date He Feng. If he is willing, Fanya finished. I was waiting for you to say that. The woman suddenly became excited. Today, my contact came to me and said that the ignorant He Feng doesn't know how to contact you. The woman said with a smile. My contact was worried that you would disagree, so he had me figure out the situation first. The woman continued to say, her whole face beaming with joy. He said that He Feng has no love experience. Although he was married, the time he lived with his wife was less than a year. The woman spilled more tea. At that moment, although He Feng wants to get along with you, he doesn't know how to say it. The woman stood up and pulled Fanya into the house. This afternoon, my contact came to my house to deliver something. He wants me to persuade you. The woman pulled Fanya into the house and pointed at the big bag of fruits on the table. Fanya could not help but find it a little funny. The woman's contact and He Feng really had the same temperament. Even the gifts were the same. Fanya finally let out a sigh of relief. Since He Feng also had this intention, Fanya did not plan to avoid it any further. She nodded at the woman and said, then I'll have to trouble you to tell them that I'm willing to go out and see. The woman clapped her hands and smiled even more happily. That's right. Fanya had just settled the matter when the woman ran to the house next door and phoned her contact. Fanya could not help but feel a little heartache when she saw the woman rushing in and out of the house. She had originally planned to apply for a phone installation recently, but now it seemed that she should install one for the woman's house as well. Mom! Tang Tang's voice came from the door, anxious and sad. Fanya rushed out of the door and saw Tang Tang standing at the door covered in mud. Fanya looked at Tang Tang's appearance worriedly and asked, what happened to you? Tang Tang, who was originally upset, immediately cried out when she heard Fanya's question. Mom, my clothes are dirty. Be good, it's fine. How did your clothes get dirty? Tell mommy. Fanya comforted Tang Tang. Tang Tang sniffed and looked at Fanya. Then, she grinned. I just hit Little Rock. Ah. Fanya looked at her daughter in shock. Her entire face froze.